let me tell you something curious about silence in the digital age. We live in a world where almost everything is shared. From birthdays and morning coffee cups to sunsets, laughter, and even pain carefully dressed in filters. Every emotion, every thought, every fleeting moment is transformed into content. Yet, amidst all this noise, there exists a quiet group of people who remain almost invisible. They scroll silently, observe deeply, but rarely ever post. You might know someone like that. Or perhaps you are someone like that. And that brings us to a question that often lingers in people's minds. Why would someone choose to remain unseen in a world that constantly rewards visibility? It's easy to assume they're shy, introverted, or simply uninterested. But the truth runs far deeper. Beneath the surface lies a quiet, complex psychology. One that reveals a lot about self-perception, emotional maturity, and a subtle rebellion against a culture obsessed with attention. For some, silence isn't emptiness, it's power. It's the freedom to decide what the world doesn't get to know. Social media has quietly redefined how we view ourselves. It rewards performance, celebrates noise, and often equates exposure with worth. But those who choose silence resist that narrative. They observe without interrupting, reflect before reacting, and process before judging. Psychologists have discovered something fascinating. People who rarely post online often score higher in traits like self-control, introspection, and emotional independence. They are less likely to be swayed by social comparison or external validation. In essence, they aren't trying to prove who they are. They're trying to understand it. And in a world constantly auditioning for belonging, that kind of authenticity is rare. Because let's be honest, most of what we post online isn't pure communication. It's performance. Every caption, every photo, every update subtly says, "This is who I am. Do you approve?" But when you step away from that cycle, something within you changes. You begin to detach your sense of worth from likes and comments. You stop thinking in captions and start experiencing life in real time again. Moments become personal instead of performative. This, perhaps, is the unspoken psychology behind people who don't post. It's not that they dislike social media. They simply crave something real in a space that often feels staged. Their silence isn't rejection, it's reflection. They're not antisocial or anti-technology. They just refuse to shrink their lives into curated highlights. Because once you've seen how easily perception can be manipulated, you start valuing what can't be captured: silence, depth, imperfection, truth. For many, the decision to stop posting comes after a kind of emotional fatigue. Maybe they once shared everything until it stopped feeling genuine. They began noticing that every time they shared something beautiful, an invisible pressure followed to keep up the act, to outdo the last post. Eventually, they weren't living, they were performing. So they quit quietly. No big announcement, no farewell post. Just a slow, graceful fading from the feed. But here's what most people get wrong. Not posting doesn't mean not feeling. It doesn't mean apathy or detachment. In fact, it often means the opposite. These individuals care deeply about presence, authenticity, and preserving what's sacred. There's a term in psychology called psychological ownership. The feeling that something belongs deeply and privately to you. It might be a thought, a memory, or an experience. But the moment you post it, that ownership weakens just a little. The moment becomes public property, open to judgment, misinterpretation, and even mockery. Those who choose silence are often protecting that sense of ownership over their own lives. They keep their experiences pure, untouched, and deeply personal. So maybe their silence isn't sadness or withdrawal at all. Maybe it's strength, the quiet kind that doesn't need validation, that values reality over performance, and that understands the rare beauty of living for yourself, not for the feed. Maybe it's a quieter kind of freedom, one that doesn't announce itself but is deeply felt. Think about it. When was the last time you did something meaningful without feeling the urge to share it? When was the last time you laughed uncontrollably, cried deeply, or achieved something personal and didn't immediately think of posting it online? That impulse, that automatic desire to display our experiences, isn't natural. It's learned. It's the byproduct of years spent inside a system built on likes, shares, and dopamine hits, training us to associate attention with worth. So, when someone steps outside of that cycle, it can seem like an act of quiet rebellion. But more than rebellion, it's a kind of healing. They start rediscovering what it feels like to live for themselves again. Cooking a meal without photographing it, traveling without tagging locations, feeling emotions without explaining them to an audience. In that private space, something reawakens. A sense of self-awareness that no longer depends on external approval. It's a return to simplicity, to authenticity, to being instead of performing. However, not everyone who withdraws from posting does so from a place of calm or contentment. For some, it's driven by fear. The fear of judgment, misunderstanding, or rejection. Social media has quietly created a psychological strain known as self-presentational pressure. The constant awareness that you're being watched even when you're not. Every post becomes a performance, every word a potential risk. For many, this invisible scrutiny becomes exhausting. They worry about being misread or worse, ignored. So, they retreat, not because they don't wish to connect, but because the price of visibility feels too heavy to bear. These individuals still long to be seen, but truly seen, not superficially acknowledged. And often, the quietest people online are the ones whose minds are the loudest. They aren't absent. They're overflowing with thoughts, emotions, and reflections. But instead of turning that inner richness into spectacle, they choose stillness. There's a profound philosophy behind that silence. In a world constantly shouting, "Look at me!" choosing invisibility becomes a statement of self-definition. It's a declaration that says, "I exist beyond your perception. My worth doesn't depend on your gaze." They scroll through the lives of others, smiling, empathizing, sometimes aching, but they rarely project their own. Because they've come to understand something most people overlook. Not everything you experience is meant to be witnessed. The most transformative moments in life, growth, grief, healing, love, often unfold in private, unseen, and unshared. When you've lived through enough of those silent evolutions, you realize that being unseen doesn't mean being insignificant. In fact, that's where the truest version of identity forms. Not performed, but discovered. Here lies the paradox. Social media was built to connect us, yet it often leaves people more isolated than ever. When you stop posting, you step out of that illusion of connection and begin to rediscover genuine closeness. You notice who reaches out, even when you're quiet, who remembers you without reminders, who values your presence without updates. That kind of bond, unbroadcasted, unfiltered, feels heavier, warmer, and infinitely more real. The people who don't post live in that sacred space. They build relationships that don't need to be proven or performed. They find beauty in the unshared moment, comfort in privacy, and peace in simply existing. Part of this silence also comes from a deep sense of identity security. The ability to know who you are, even when no one's watching. When you're truly comfortable in your own company, you no longer need an audience to validate your worth. That isn't arrogance, it's serenity. And perhaps most ironically, those who share the least often have the richest stories to tell. But they save them for when you're sitting across from them, not across a screen. Because to them, real connection isn't built through comments or likes. It's found in shared silence, in laughter that doesn't need witnesses, in eye contact that speaks louder than words. These are the quiet ones, the deep thinkers, the silent observers, the ones who carry entire worlds within them. They don't need the world to applaud their existence, because they've already found peace in simply being. They don't need to document every moment. They just need to live it. And maybe, just maybe, in a world so desperate to be seen, their silence isn't a flaw at all. It's a mirror. A quiet reminder that not everything meaningful needs to be shared, that sometimes the most human thing you can do is to keep something entirely for yourself. There's a kind of sacredness in privacy, a sense of ownership over your own experiences that no one else can touch. What's fascinating is how perspective begins to shift the longer someone stays away from social media. Colors seem richer, time feels slower, and conversations start to carry more weight. Life becomes textured again. Stepping away from the noise makes everything feel more real, as if the world itself exhales. Because when you stop performing, you start experiencing. There's a quiet beauty in walking through life without needing proof of every step. No worries about angles, lighting, or captions. You're just there, fully alive, fully present, inside the moment instead of hovering outside of it, trying to frame it. That kind of presence is something social media rarely allows anymore. But the psychology behind this goes much deeper than personal taste or preference. It's tied to how our brains process validation. Every time we post something and receive likes, comments, or hearts, our brain releases dopamine, the same chemical responsible for reward and addiction. Over time, this becomes a loop. We share to feel validated, and we feel validated because we share. Slowly, we begin to think not in terms of real experiences, but in terms of shareable ones. Now imagine someone who breaks free from that cycle. Someone who deliberately chooses to disconnect from the dopamine-driven rhythm of validation. That isn't disinterest, it's discipline. It takes incredible self-awareness to resist something designed to keep you hooked. Psychologists call this an internal locus of control. The idea that your sense of worth and happiness comes from within, not from the approval of others. People with this mindset don't need the digital echo of "you're enough" to believe it. They carry that truth quietly, without applause. Even science supports this. Studies have found that individuals who take extended breaks from social media, or use it sparingly, often report higher levels of emotional stability, clarity, and overall life satisfaction. When your identity isn't constantly being reflected and reshaped through others' perceptions, it becomes more grounded, more real. You stop editing your life into a highlight reel and start embracing it in all its raw, unfiltered complexity. And perhaps that's the ultimate rebellion, staying whole in a world that rewards fragments. However, silence online doesn't always stem from peace. Sometimes it's born out of exhaustion. For many, social media started as a space for connection, but slowly turned into a source of quiet fatigue. It's draining to constantly witness everyone else's highlight reels while you're still working through your own behind the scenes. You begin to compare without meaning to question your worth even when you know better. Eventually, some people step away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They come to realize that they don't owe anyone a performance. They don't owe the world an explanation for their silence. And most importantly, they don't need to keep proving they're happy just to be believed. That's one of the quiet truths of this generation. We've mistaken visibility for value. We assume that to matter, we must be noticed, but real meaning doesn't require witnesses. Some of the most defining moments of your life, the ones that truly shape who you are, will happen away from cameras, without captions, and without an audience. Just you and the moment. And maybe that's what those who don't post understand best. They know that privacy isn't loneliness, it's intimacy with yourself. Because when you stop broadcasting every thought, you begin to hear your own again. You reconnect with the parts of yourself that got lost in the noise, your quiet desires, your unspoken fears, your inner compass. There's something profoundly spiritual about that in today's hyper-connected world. It's not withdrawal, it's a homecoming, a gentle return to yourself, to authenticity, to peace. Of course, this journey isn't always peaceful. There are moments of doubt, waves of temptation to return to the feed, to measure yourself again against the constant hum of other people's lives. But each time you resist, you reclaim a little more of your presence. You start to realize that the truest form of freedom doesn't come from being seen. It comes from simply being. There are moments of doubt, moments when silence feels like invisibility, when you wonder if your quiet existence makes you fade into the background while everyone else seems to be performing progress. The world moves fast, and sometimes it feels like if you're not constantly documenting your growth, it doesn't count. But with time, something subtle and beautiful begins to unfold. You realize that your worth doesn't vanish just because it isn't witnessed. It remains steady, humming beneath the noise, like the calm after a storm. And maybe that's what real confidence looks like. Not the loud display of self online, but the quiet certainty of self offline. People often say, if you didn't post it, did it even happen? But the truth is, the moments that shape us most deeply rarely make it to the feed. Your heartbreaks, your private victories, your quiet acts of kindness, your late-night realizations, they live in memory, not media. And maybe that's enough, because what truly matters isn't how many people saw it, it's how deeply it changed you. Psychologists talk about authentic self-expression, a state where who you are inside aligns with how you show up in the world. What they call congruence. But in an age ruled by filters, edits, and endless scrolling, that alignment is easily lost. We begin to live as edited versions of ourselves, curated for validation instead of truth. So when someone chooses not to post, it isn't indifference. It's an act of integrity, a way of protecting their inner peace and preserving the fragile harmony between their private and public self. They don't need to share every moment to prove it's real. They don't need to capture every sunset to remember how it felt. They simply live, fully, quietly, and meaningfully. And here's the paradox. Those who live most silently often feel life most intensely. Without the distraction of performance, they notice everything others miss. The warmth in someone's voice, the flicker of light through leaves, the comfort of silence between friends. They experience life in its rawest form, unfiltered and unedited. They don't rush to capture it, they live it. And in a world built on constant attention, presence has become the rarest and purest currency. Yet, such presence is often misunderstood. Their silence may be mistaken for distance, their calm for indifference. But look closer. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's depth. It's the peace that comes from no longer needing to explain yourself just to be understood. It's the quiet strength of not needing to be known by everyone, only by those who truly matter. The people who don't post understand something profound. Not every truth deserves to be performed. Some parts of your life are meant to remain untouched, safe from algorithms, trends, and opinions. Because once a moment becomes public, it stops being completely yours. It belongs to interpretation, to judgment, to noise. And some experiences are too sacred for that. Some emotions are meant to be felt, not displayed. So the next time you notice someone who rarely posts, don't assume they're disconnected. Maybe they're just living. Maybe they found peace in the quiet corners of existence, in the spaces not lit by the blue glow of a screen. Maybe they've remembered what so many have forgotten, that being unseen doesn't mean being alone. And being quiet doesn't mean being empty, because sometimes the truest expression of who you are is silence itself. In the end, we're not meant to be performances. We're meant to be people. And the ones who don't post remind us of that truth in every quiet, unfiltered, beautifully invisible way. If this message spoke to you, if you believe in depth over display, in presence over performance, then subscribe to Truth to Mastery. Let's build a community that values authenticity, introspection, and the beauty of being real in a world that never stops performing. Stay connected to more thought-provoking content that inspires you to look within, not just scroll beyond. Because real wisdom begins in silence, and together, we can master it.